If someone had told you that there is a single change capable of making your reality reorganize itself without force, without endless repetition, and without waiting for the perfect moment, you probably would have dismissed it as another empty promise. That is exactly why what you are about to discover deserves your complete attention. For decades, people have searched outside themselves for the missing technique, the hidden ritual, the perfect frequency, or the miraculous method that would finally transform their lives. Yet one of the most intriguing researchers of consciousness, Jacobo Grinberg, pointed toward something radically different. He suggested that reality may not be a fixed structure we passively inhabit, but something deeply connected to the quality of our own perception. If that possibility is even partially true, then the greatest limitation you have ever faced was never the world around you. It was the invisible way your mind learned to interpret it. And once that interpretation changes, reality itself may begin to appear as if it has changed with it. Stay with me until the end, because what we're about to explore is not another motivational speech or another simplistic explanation of manifestation. This is a journey into one of the most fascinating ways of understanding consciousness ever proposed. And by the time this video is over, you may never look at your thoughts, your emotions, or your life in the same way again. Before we continue, I want to invite you to participate in something that makes this community unique. Write in the comments one honest sentence about the reality you are choosing to build from this moment forward. Not because words possess magical power by themselves, but because when thousands of people consciously express a clear intention together, they strengthen a shared field of focus and purpose. Many people return to these comments days or even months later and discover they are no longer the same person who wrote those first words. If this content resonates with you, consider supporting this work with a super chat. It allows these deep explorations of consciousness to continue reaching more people. Subscribe if you haven't already, become a channel member if you'd like to support future videos, leave a like if you enjoy this kind of content, and share this video with someone who has been searching for answers beyond conventional explanations. Now imagine waking up tomorrow in exactly the same room, surrounded by the same objects, speaking to the same people, following the same routine, yet somehow experiencing an entirely different life. At first, that sounds impossible because we've been conditioned to believe that reality changes only after external circumstances change. We wait for more money before feeling abundant. We wait for love before feeling complete. We wait for success before believing in ourselves. Everything seems to move from outside to inside. But what if that sequence has always been reversed? What if your experience of reality begins long before reality appears to confirm it? Jacobo Grinberg spent years investigating consciousness, not as a passive observer, but as an explorer, willing to question assumptions that most people never even notice. His work suggested that perception is not merely a window through which we observe the universe. It may be an active participant in the continuous construction of what we call reality. This idea does not ask us to deny the physical world. Instead, it asks a much deeper question. How much of what you experience is determined by the world itself, and how much is determined by the way your consciousness organizes the information constantly flowing through it? Think about how two people can live through the exact same event and come away with completely different realities. One sees opportunity while another sees disaster. One finds meaning where another finds only chaos. The event is identical, yet the worlds they inhabit become completely different. We often explain this by saying they simply have different perspectives. But Grinberg's ideas invite us to consider something far more profound. Perhaps perspective is not merely an opinion layered on top of reality. Perhaps perspective is one of the very mechanisms through which reality becomes experience. If consciousness continuously organizes countless possibilities into the single experience we call the present moment, then changing consciousness is not escaping reality. It is changing the relationship from which reality is experienced. This changes everything because most people spend their entire lives trying to rearrange external circumstances while leaving untouched the internal structure that keeps producing the same interpretations, the same expectations, the same emotional patterns, and ultimately the same results. They decorate the surface while the foundation remains exactly as it was. Then they wonder why every new beginning eventually feels like another version of the past. They mistake familiarity for destiny, They mistake repetition for truth. They mistake conditioning for identity. The remarkable possibility suggested by Grinberg's work is that your consciousness possesses a flexibility far greater than you have ever imagined. The patterns you call your personality, your limitations, your fears, and even your certainty about what is possible, may not be permanent characteristics at all. They may simply be stable organizations of perception that have become so familiar you stopped recognizing them as patterns. Once something becomes familiar enough, the mind mistakes it for reality itself. Yet familiarity is not the same thing as truth. A belief repeated for 20 years still remains a belief. An emotional habit repeated every day still remains a habit. And what is organized one way may eventually be reorganized another way. That is why the true quantum leap is not a dramatic event visible to everyone around you. It begins in absolute silence, long before anyone notices that anything has changed. It begins when your relationship with your own awareness starts becoming more coherent than your relationship with your old conditioning. At first, nothing seems different. The same conversations continue. The same environment surrounds you. The same responsibilities remain. Yet internally, something subtle begins to stabilize. You stop reacting automatically. You begin observing instead of immediately identifying with every thought. You notice that fear appears, but you also notice that the one observing the fear is somehow untouched by it. That simple distinction becomes the beginning of extraordinary freedom, because once awareness is no longer completely fused with every mental pattern, those patterns slowly lose the authority they once possessed. And perhaps, without realizing it, that is the moment your reality has already begun to reorganize. There is an interesting paradox hidden inside almost every human being. We spend years searching for extraordinary experiences while overlooking the extraordinary mechanism through which every experience already exists. Imagine standing in front of an immense landscape at sunrise. One person sees only another morning. Another feels overwhelmed by beauty. Another becomes nostalgic. Another suddenly discovers a purpose that changes the direction of an entire life. The mountain did not change. The sun did not shine differently. The air carried the same temperature for everyone standing there. Yet 4 completely different realities emerged from one single moment. Most people conclude that reality is objective and that emotions are merely personal reactions. Grinberg invites us to entertain a more subtle possibility. What if perception itself is an active, creative process? What if consciousness does not simply record the world but participates continuously in giving shape to the reality each person experiences? This idea becomes even more fascinating when you realize how much of your daily life happens automatically. Think about your morning routine. You probably wake up at nearly the same hour, follow similar movements, notice familiar concerns, anticipate familiar conversations, and carry familiar expectations into the day. None of this seems unusual because repetition gradually becomes invisible. The brain learns efficiency by creating patterns, and those patterns eventually become so deeply embedded that they begin operating without your conscious participation. You no longer decide how to interpret many situations. Interpretation happens before you even notice it. Someone looks at you without smiling, and the mind immediately invents a story. An unexpected bill arrives, and anxiety appears before rational thought has a chance to speak. A small setback occurs, and suddenly memories of previous disappointments flood into the present moment. It feels as though reality itself has produced these emotions. But perhaps what actually happened is that an old internal organization instantly reconstructed a familiar version of reality. According to ideas inspired by Grinberg's exploration of consciousness, what we perceive is inseparable from the organization of awareness itself. The world that seems so solid may be filtered through countless invisible processes that determine what receives attention, what becomes meaningful, and what disappears into the background unnoticed. Consider how often you purchase a new car or begin thinking about a particular subject, only to suddenly notice it everywhere. Those objects were always present, but they did not exist within the center of your awareness until something reorganized your perception. Reality appeared to change even though what truly changed was the structure through which you encountered it. Now imagine extending that principle far beyond cars or familiar faces. Imagine applying it to opportunity, creativity, confidence, relationships, abundance, or even peace of mind. If awareness determines what possibilities become visible, then every transformation begins not by forcing new events into existence, but by becoming capable of perceiving possibilities that previously remained hidden beneath habitual thinking. Suddenly, the quantum leap is no longer about escaping one universe and entering another. It becomes the gradual emergence of a reality that was always available but inaccessible because your consciousness had not yet become compatible with perceiving it. This is where many people become impatient. They expect immediate external evidence. They want dramatic proof that everything has shifted overnight. Yet nature rarely operates that way. Think about how a tree grows. Day after day it appears unchanged. You could stare at it every afternoon for a week and swear nothing is happening. Beneath the surface, however, countless invisible processes are taking place. Cells divide, roots deepen, water travels upward. Strength accumulates silently until one day the growth becomes impossible to ignore. Consciousness develops with similar subtlety. Internal coherence often becomes established long before external circumstances begin reflecting it. Perhaps you have already experienced moments that hinted at this without recognizing them. Have you ever met someone who radiated calm in situations that would normally create panic, or encountered an individual whose presence alone seemed to transform the atmosphere of a room? Often these people have not mastered external events. They have cultivated an internal stability that no longer depends entirely upon circumstances. Others instinctively sense that coherence because coherence influences perception, communication, and behavior in ways that cannot always be explained through words alone. Grinberg's perspective encourages us to stop treating consciousness as a secondary phenomenon produced by the brain, and instead begin asking whether consciousness itself may play a more fundamental role in experience than modern culture usually assumes. Whether one interprets his work philosophically, psychologically, or spiritually, the invitation remains remarkably practical. Observe the observer. Notice the structure beneath the thoughts. Become curious about the silent awareness that exists before every opinion, every memory, and every emotional reaction. That awareness does not struggle to become something else. It simply witnesses. And in witnessing, something remarkable begins to happen. The automatic patterns that once seemed inseparable from your identity gradually reveal themselves as processes rather than permanent truths. This realization changes the meaning of personal transformation entirely. You are no longer trying to manufacture a better version of yourself through force or constant self-improvement. Instead, you begin removing unnecessary layers of identification. Imagine polishing a mirror that has collected dust for decades. You do not create the mirror's ability to reflect. You merely remove what obscured it. Likewise, awareness does not need to become more powerful. It only needs to become less entangled with repetitive conditioning. Every moment of genuine observation cleans another small portion of that mirror. One of the greatest obstacles to this process is the belief that change must always feel dramatic. In reality, the deepest transformations often feel surprisingly ordinary. One morning you notice that something which once provoked intense fear now produces only curiosity. A conversation that previously would have led to anger now inspires compassion. An old dream that once felt impossible suddenly appears achievable without any obvious external reason. These moments seem insignificant individually, yet together they represent a complete reorganization of your inner world. And because your actions naturally emerge from that inner world, your external life slowly begins reflecting changes that were invisible during their earliest stages. This is why genuine quantum transformation cannot be reduced to repeating affirmations without awareness or visualizing endlessly while remaining emotionally attached to old patterns. Those practices may have value for some people, but without a deeper shift in the organization of consciousness, they often become another habit layered upon the existing structure. The foundation remains untouched, while new decorations are placed on top. Grinberg's ideas encourage something much more fundamental. Rather than convincing yourself of a new reality, become aware of the mechanism through which every reality is experienced. Once that mechanism begins changing, what you perceive, how you respond, and ultimately the life you build, can begin changing in ways that seem almost effortless compared to the constant struggle of trying to control every external circumstance. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about consciousness is the assumption that it exists only inside the individual. From the moment we are born, we learn to think of ourselves as isolated minds, moving through an external world populated by other isolated minds. We become accustomed to drawing invisible boundaries between me and everything else. Yet when you begin observing your experience carefully, those boundaries become far less obvious than they first appear. Every emotion you feel is influenced by your environment. Every conversation subtly reshapes your thinking. Every memory changes each time you remember it. Every expectation influences the way you interpret the next moment. Your consciousness is not sealed inside your skull like an object inside a container. It is continuously interacting with everything you perceive. This observation lies at the heart of why transformation cannot be understood as merely changing thoughts. It is about changing the quality of the relationship between awareness and experience itself. Imagine entering a crowded room where people are anxious, distracted, and impatient. Without anyone saying a word to you, your breathing may become slightly faster. Your muscles may tighten almost imperceptibly. Your attention begins scanning for potential problems. Now imagine walking into another room where everyone is calm, focused, and deeply present. Again, before a single conversation begins, your entire nervous system may respond differently. These shifts happen so naturally that we rarely question them, yet they reveal something profound. Consciousness is constantly participating in an exchange far more dynamic than we consciously recognize. We influence reality while simultaneously being influenced by it. The relationship flows in both directions every moment of every day. Jacobo Grinberg explored ideas suggesting that beneath ordinary perception exists a deeper level of organization from which our experienced reality emerges. Whether one interprets this literally, symbolically, or philosophically, the practical implication remains remarkably powerful. If the quality of consciousness influences the quality of experience, then cultivating greater coherence within yourself becomes one of the most meaningful actions you can take. Not because the universe is granting special favors, but because the structure through which you engage reality is becoming clearer, more stable, and less fragmented. Think about how much energy is consumed by internal contradiction. One part of the mind desires change while another fears it. One part seeks abundance while another quietly believes it is undeserved. One part longs for meaningful relationships while another expects rejection before anyone has spoken a single word. These opposing tendencies generate constant internal noise. Most people assume this noise is simply who they are. They identify with every conflicting voice until confusion becomes normal. Yet awareness itself is not confused. Awareness simply observes the movement of those conflicting patterns. The moment you stop identifying completely with every internal dialogue, space begins to appear. And within that space, coherence slowly replaces conflict. This coherence is not emotional excitement. In fact, it often feels surprisingly peaceful. Many people expect profound transformation to arrive with fireworks, overwhelming certainty, or dramatic mystical experiences. Sometimes those moments happen, but they rarely sustain lasting change by themselves. Lasting change resembles the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needs to argue with reality. Imagine standing beside a calm lake early in the morning. The water becomes so still that it reflects the sky with astonishing clarity. Now imagine throwing dozens of stones into that same lake every few seconds. The reflection disappears, not because the sky has changed, but because the surface has become too disturbed to reveal it clearly. Consciousness behaves in much the same way. When constant fear, compulsive thinking, emotional reactivity, and endless distraction agitate awareness, reality becomes distorted through that turbulence. As coherence develops, perception itself becomes clearer. This may explain why moments of genuine insight often arrive unexpectedly. They appear while taking a walk, sitting quietly, listening to rain, or simply allowing the mind to settle. We call these experiences inspiration, intuition, or sudden clarity. Yet perhaps they are not mysterious interruptions at all. Perhaps they are what naturally emerges when internal noise briefly subsides. The answer was never absent. It was simply hidden beneath layers of unnecessary mental activity. There is another reason why this matters. Every decision you make originates from the quality of awareness available in that moment. If awareness is dominated by fear, your choices naturally reflect fear. If awareness is shaped by scarcity, opportunities become difficult to recognize even when they appear directly in front of you. If awareness becomes increasingly coherent, however, entirely different possibilities begin presenting themselves. You notice conversations you would previously have ignored. You recognize patterns that once seemed invisible. You become less reactive and therefore more creative. Creativity itself begins emerging not because you forced new ideas into existence, but because your consciousness is no longer occupied defending old limitations. This is what many people describe as a quantum leap, although the phrase is often misunderstood. It is tempting to imagine instantly leaving one reality and waking up in another completely different world. Yet perhaps the real leap is subtler and far more profound. It is the moment your perception becomes organized around a new level of awareness. From that point forward, every experience is interpreted through a different internal structure. The external world may initially appear almost identical, but your relationship with it has fundamentally changed. That altered relationship gradually produces different behaviors, different decisions, different interactions, and eventually different circumstances. Looking back months or years later, it feels as though your entire life shifted all at once, even though the transformation actually unfolded through countless small moments of increasing coherence. One of the most liberating aspects of this perspective is that it removes the pressure to control every detail of life. Control is exhausting because reality is infinitely more complex than any individual mind can manage. Coherence, however, is different. Instead of attempting to manipulate every event, you cultivate the quality of consciousness through which every event is experienced. You stop fighting every wave and begin understanding the ocean itself. This shift from control to coherence represents one of the deepest forms of freedom available to human beings. The irony is that the more you seek certainty through external circumstances, the more fragile your peace becomes. Every unexpected event threatens your emotional stability. Every delay becomes evidence that something is wrong. Every obstacle feels personal. But as awareness matures, certainty begins arising from somewhere entirely different. It no longer depends on constant validation from the outside world. It emerges from direct familiarity with consciousness itself. You begin trusting your capacity to meet reality rather than demanding that reality constantly conform to your expectations. And in that quiet confidence, something extraordinary begins happening. The world no longer appears as a prison built from fixed limitations. It gradually reveals itself as a living field of possibilities, responding in ways you may never have imagined when your awareness was still confined by old patterns of perception. There comes a moment in every genuine inner journey when you begin questioning something far more important than whether reality can change. You begin asking a quieter and more unsettling question. Who is the one experiencing this reality in the first place? Most people have never seriously examined this question because daily life moves too quickly. There are responsibilities to fulfill, goals to pursue, problems to solve, and endless distractions competing for attention. Yet beneath all of those activities remains a silent presence that has been with you since your earliest memory. It was there when you were a child. It was there during moments of joy and moments of heartbreak. It witnessed every success, every mistake, every fear, every triumph, while somehow remaining unchanged by the passing of them all. Thoughts changed, beliefs changed, your body changed, your relationships changed. Even your understanding of yourself transformed countless times. Yet something continued observing every one of those transformations. That silent observer may be the most overlooked aspect of human existence. When Grinberg explored consciousness, he was not merely searching for explanations about mystical experiences. He was attempting to understand the fundamental relationship between awareness and reality itself. If awareness is more than a passive spectator, then learning to recognize its nature becomes one of the most revolutionary discoveries a person can make. Consider how much of your identity has been built from memories. You remember what others said about you. You remember failures that convinced you to become cautious. You remember achievements that shaped your confidence. Memory gradually forms a narrative, and eventually that narrative begins introducing itself as who you are. But if you observe carefully, Memories are simply experiences appearing within awareness. They are not awareness itself. Thoughts are movements inside consciousness. They are not consciousness. Emotions arise, intensify, and disappear. They too are observed. Even your sense of identity shifts throughout life. The observer remains. This distinction may sound philosophical at first, yet its practical implications are enormous. Imagine watching clouds move across the sky. No matter how dark or dramatic they become, the sky itself remains untouched. Storms do not damage the openness through which they pass. In much the same way, awareness possesses an extraordinary capacity to observe every mental event without becoming permanently defined by it. The problem is that most people have forgotten the difference between the sky and the clouds. Every fearful thought immediately becomes my fear. Every anxious prediction becomes my future. Every painful memory becomes my identity. Without realizing it, awareness becomes completely identified with temporary mental activity. Once that identification becomes habitual, suffering feels inevitable because the mind never stops producing new patterns. What happens if that identification begins loosening? Not because you force yourself to think positively, but because you genuinely recognize that every thought is something you experience rather than something you fundamentally are. This is where transformation quietly accelerates. Instead of fighting negative thoughts, you begin observing them. Instead of suppressing fear, you become curious about its movement. Instead of resisting uncertainty, you notice how much unnecessary energy resistance consumes. Observation replaces reaction. Presence replaces compulsion. Gradually, the mind loses its habit of pulling awareness into every emotional current that passes through. At first, this may seem insignificant. After all, observing a thought does not immediately change your bank account, your career, or your relationships. Yet something much more important begins changing. The source from which every decision originates starts becoming clearer. A person identified with fear inevitably makes fearful decisions. A person identified with resentment inevitably interprets reality through resentment. A person rooted in clear awareness, however, responds rather than reacts. That single difference quietly transforms every conversation, every opportunity, every relationship, and every challenge encountered afterward. Think about how often your greatest regrets came from automatic reactions rather than conscious choices. Words spoken in anger. Opportunities ignored because fear seemed convincing. Relationships abandoned because assumptions felt like facts. Entire years spent repeating patterns that were never consciously examined. None of these experiences happened because awareness lacked intelligence. They happened because awareness became temporarily absorbed inside unconscious programming. The programming spoke, acted, decided, and interpreted, while awareness simply believed it was listening to its authentic self. Grinberg's perspective encourages an entirely different possibility. Instead of asking, "How do I force reality to change?" ask, "What is shaping the consciousness through which I encounter reality every moment?" That question immediately shifts attention away from external struggle toward internal clarity. It is no longer about escaping your current life. It is about becoming increasingly aware of the invisible architecture that gives your current life its meaning. There is remarkable freedom in recognizing that perception is never completely finished. Every day your consciousness reorganizes itself through experience. New insights appear, old certainties dissolve. Habits weaken or strengthen depending on where awareness repeatedly invests its attention. This means you are not imprisoned by the person you believed yourself to be yesterday. Identity is far more fluid than the mind usually admits. What feels permanent today may eventually become little more than a memory of an earlier version of yourself. This is why some people appear to transform almost beyond recognition. Friends wonder what happened to them. Family members say they seem like entirely different people. From the outside, it appears mysterious. From the inside, the process often feels surprisingly simple. They stopped feeding certain patterns. They became less fascinated by fear. They developed a different relationship with uncertainty. They learned to remain present without immediately escaping into habitual thinking. Slowly, the old organization dissolved because it no longer received the same unconscious reinforcement. Notice that none of this requires believing extraordinary claims. It requires only honest observation. Every moment offers evidence. Watch how quickly the mind labels situations before fully understanding them. Watch how memory influences expectation. Watch how expectation influences perception. Watch how perception influences emotion. Watch how emotion influences action. Eventually you begin recognizing that what seemed like separate events are actually part of one continuous movement inside consciousness. Once that movement becomes visible, it also becomes transformable. Perhaps this is why the deepest shifts rarely begin with acquiring something new. They begin with seeing clearly what has always been operating beneath the surface. Clarity dissolves illusions without violence. Awareness reorganizes itself naturally when it no longer mistakes conditioning for truth. And when consciousness becomes organized around direct observation instead of automatic identification, life itself begins unfolding differently. Not because reality suddenly obeys your wishes, but because you are no longer meeting reality through the same invisible patterns that once kept recreating the same experiences over and over again. As we reach the end of this journey, I want to leave you with one final reflection. Perhaps the greatest discovery is not that reality can change. Perhaps it is realizing that the one who experiences reality is never as limited as the mind has always believed. Every moment offers a choice. You can continue interpreting life through the same patterns that have followed you for years, or you can begin observing those patterns with a clarity that slowly dissolves their influence. The moment awareness becomes more powerful than habit, transformation is no longer something you chase. It becomes something that unfolds naturally. Jacobo Grinberg dedicated much of his life to exploring questions that most people never dare to ask. While many aspects of his work continue to inspire discussion and interpretation, one message remains profoundly meaningful. Consciousness deserves to be explored directly, not merely accepted through second-hand explanations. No theory, no book, and no video can replace your own experience. The true experiment begins the moment this video ends. So, for the next few days, pay close attention to yourself. Observe how quickly the mind creates stories about the future. Notice how often it repeats memories as though they were permanent truths. Watch how emotions rise, reach their peak, and eventually fade away. Through all of those movements, ask yourself a simple question. Who is the one observing all of this? Do not rush to answer it intellectually. Allow the question to remain alive. Sometimes the most important answers arrive not through thinking more, but through seeing more clearly. You may discover that what you once called your limitations were simply familiar patterns of perception. You may realize that your deepest potential has never been something waiting in the future, but something quietly present beneath the noise of constant mental activity. And if that is true, then every moment becomes an opportunity to experience life from a different level of awareness. Remember, a genuine quantum leap is rarely loud. It often begins in complete silence. It starts when your consciousness becomes less fragmented, less reactive, and more coherent than it was yesterday. From that point forward, your decisions change, your relationships change. The opportunities you recognize begin to change. Gradually, your life reflects the transformation that first occurred within your awareness. If this exploration has expanded the way you think about consciousness and reality, let me know in the comments what insight stayed with you the most. I read your reflections, and they often become the inspiration for future conversations on this channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and activate notifications so you won't miss our next exploration into the mysteries of consciousness, perception, and the extraordinary potential of the human mind. Until next time, continue questioning, continue observing, and above all, never underestimate the quiet power of a conscious mind. Sometimes the greatest revolution does not happen in the world around you. It happens in the way you see it. And once that changes, everything else may begin to change as well.